Hey everyone, it's Austin Solomon, and welcome to this week's episode of the Real Wausau Real Estate Show. Today I'm joined by Justin Bates, attorney at Bates Legal Group. Justin, how are you?
Doing great, Austin. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited for this week's episode of the show. Today we're doing a little bit of more like legal talks, talking with the attorney. Definitely excited. This is going to be more of a casual episode. We're just going to have a conversation, and I myself am going to be asking a lot of questions and learning throughout this podcast episode too. So, Justin, you guys have the you're the legal group, Bates Legal Group in Wausau, over on Washington Street, the old train station. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself. Your background. Did you grow up in the area in Wausau?
I did not. I'm a transplant. My wife is from here, which is something I've discovered is a reason why a lot of transplants wind up moving to Wausau. So I've been in Wausau for about 13 years. Originally grew up in the north suburbs of Chicago, and which I think gives me a little bit of an edge.
Yeah, no doubt.
My dad actually dabbled in real estate brokerage for a while. And I remember when he was doing all of his studying and all of that I always found real estate to be something that was very interesting to me. Mm-hmm. And so it kind of just naturally found its way into my practice area, and I just ran with it. But yeah, I've been in Wausau for about 13 years. Have a wife, 2 kids. They've grown up here. We bought the train station building and have been in it for just about 3 years right now. Actually, July 2017 is when we opened up shop. Before that, had been in the area practicing for 10 years. So my practice areas are mainly focused in real estate law, commercial and business law, and financial institution representation, banks and credit unions. So we do a lot of putting together loans. We take loans apart. We liquidate. We work on real estate transactions on the residential and on the commercial side. Advise on what would be the best way to purchase real estate. Is it conventional financing? Is it seller financing? And then we litigate those issues as well when things go south. And unfortunately, they do. Sometimes people come in and they're a little hesitant to hire a lawyer, as many people I know are, and I'm sure many people who are listening are. And when I always tell people in the room, and I chuckle after I say it, is lawyers are going to get you coming or going when it comes to something like this.
Right.
And it's going to be much more cost effective to do it on the front end instead of litigating with a seller or a buyer or a business partner on the back end.
Right.
Those are things that people should try to avoid and usually do.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. So, when you get into a contract or you get into a land contract or a situation like that, it's much better to spend, you could spend, a couple grand, make sure depending on what it is, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Depending on what it is, you could spend, it's better to spend things up front, make sure you have the proper structure than to get into something that's not done well, and then you could face some potential issues.
Oh, absolutely. We call them internet specials.
Yeah. Right.
Not in the age of Google, and I know that it hits the real estate brokerage industry as well with a Zillow or something that
Yep.
I'm sure is the bane of your existence.
Yep.
The bane of our existence is an Avo or other areas where they will give you forms. And they say, hey, look, all you need to do is use these forms. There's always a disclaimer that says you probably should consult with an attorney, but they give you the form. The trick with forms is there is no one-size-fits-all approach commonly. Mm-hmm. So you could get fortunate and have the most simplistic of situations and the most reasonable parties involved and use a form, and you'll think it didn't matter because in that particular situation, everybody wanted to work with each other. Mm-hmm. But the second something goes sideways, I can almost guarantee you that the internet form will not protect you or will create more trouble than it's worth. Or worse yet, you'll think you have A when you really have B. And especially if you're dealing with strong personalities and everybody digs in, that's when I talk about the back end. That's when it's going to be litigation. And you see that more commonly on, like you mentioned, on a land contract, that the average person, for whatever reason, is aware of, however, isn't aware of the sort of the pitfalls and the difficulties that can arise as a result of those. So in my practice, and I meet with people on these commonly, I'll have somebody come in and say, hey, I want to sell to my daughter on a land contract. I want to sell the family house to my daughter. And I'll say, well, hold on, time out. Why don't we talk about doing it? If you're going to be the bank, why don't we talk about how a bank would do it with a note, with a mortgage, and do it a little bit more traditionally from a banking or a lending perspective and from a legal perspective, and get rid of the thing that you think is the easy thing to do. Because I promise you, if that daughter winds up getting divorced and there are judgments that show up, especially if those judgments are from some of the more wonderful creditors that we have, like the IRS, for example, you're going to have a huge issue trying to get that property back in your name. And it just is easier when it's a note and a mortgage for a variety of reasons that are probably not super interesting to the listeners. But I can tell you that the note and the mortgage route is the way to go.
Right, right. So let's take a step back for our listeners here. So in land contracts, much more popular probably in like 2009, 2010, 11, 12, when things weren't selling with traditional, financing. So tell our listeners, like, what is like a basic land contract?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They definitely gained popularity during that time period, and I think that's probably why more people are aware of them today. And as a result of not being able to obtain traditional financing, especially after the Fed's, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, was created and then started putting in additional requirements for lending, like ability to repay and certain ratios that needed to be followed. That made it more complex, more difficult for certain people to qualify, and it really boxed a lot of people out of the market for financing entirely, which was an unintended consequence. So land contracts regain popularity. And so what a land contract is basically it's a contract between the seller, which is considered a vendor in those situations, and the buyer, who's a vendee. Mm-hmm. And what the buyer does is obtains, the property's transferred to their name, and they obtain legal title while the equitable title of the property is split and is retained by the vendor. So then from there, the vendee acts as though they are the owner, and indeed they are. And they maintain the property, and they usually insure it, pay the taxes on it, but that's set forth in the land contract terms itself. Mm-hmm. And there's interest and there's payments that are made. Usually the concept is it's not a 30-year fixed rate deal, right. Not traditional financing. So the loan will balloon, even though there's not a quote-unquote loan in the land contract itself. The land contract will expire prior to the time where all of the payments would regularly be made. So what that means is in 4 years or 5 years, whatever the term of the land contract is, that's when you're supposed to be able to go obtain traditional financing. The reality of the situation is most people still haven't improved their credit score enough in order to do that, or their circumstances haven't otherwise changed from an income to debt ratio. So they don't have the ability to get that, and now the land contract matures. And now it's, how do I want to deal with that from the seller-buyer relationship? If it's an arm's length transaction situation where you didn't know the vendee and you're the vendor, it might be a little bit easier for you to say, okay, well, you're either going to pay me or I'm going to go to the next step, which is a strict foreclosure as opposed to the more traditional judicial foreclosure that we see on the bank and credit union lending side with notes and mortgages. Mm-hmm. So they're all very similar, but they have some distinct differences that make them more or less a bad fit when it comes to the land contract. So
right.
Yeah, it can be a problem, especially when family gets involved. And then what most people don't understand is, well, you've been paying me for 5 years, but you didn't really always make the $800 a month that it said you were supposed to. And now what do you owe me when this is done? And the average person doesn't have an amortization calculator on their computer to set that forth and recalculate that in real time. So it becomes very complicated.
Right. Yeah, and what's interesting is, so there's like so many places we could go with this, because on my end, right, a lot of times I will get, so like when we're marketing our houses, maybe we put them out on like Zillow, Craigslist, Facebook, etc. And a lot of times we'll have people reach out to us. Traditionally, like Facebook Marketplace and Craigslist tend to be two of the common places. Mm. But anyway, people will reach out and say, hey, would the seller be open to doing a land contract, right? And in my experience, so I've sold 650 houses as an agent, and I've never done a land contract. And it's interesting because, and I think a lot of times people, the buyers, they know that, hey, I can't get traditional financing for whatever reason, typically credit or income or a combination of both. And so their next resort is, hey, will the sellers do a land contract, right? Well, 95, probably 99% of sellers don't want to do a land contract. They want to sell it outright. But the 1 to 2% that knows the benefits of doing a land contract, and I hate to say it, but traditionally could take advantage of someone. I hate to say it, but it's kind of, I mean, do you disagree?
No, I agree 100%. Well, first of all, before I forget, if you've sold approximately 650 homes, one of them was mine, and you did it in like 9 days. So
that was really good. That was a super quick closing. Yeah.
Austin killed it. So anybody listening out there, he knows what he's doing, and he works his tail off. But what I'll tell you is on the land contract side, yes, the savvy seller who has no problem taking advantage of a situation could very easily do so and justify it by saying, look, you came to me, asked me if I want, you couldn't get financing, so I agreed to do this for you. In 4 years when this thing matures and you owe, let's say on a $250,000 purchase price, in 4 years, you're still going to owe me over $200,000. Well, if you don't have that laying around, which most people don't, especially if you couldn't get financing, you probably have some financial difficulties. So what's going to happen is that seller could easily just say, look, I'm going through the strict foreclosure process and I'm taking the house back, and the buyer would lose any and all equity in that property, including if there was a down payment. None of that comes back. So I know a lot of buyers look at that as, well, it's kind of like a rent to own situation, but what's the worst that could happen? That. And that's a real big one. And from the seller's perspective, rinse and repeat, right? So take it back, find somebody else to buy it on land contract.
Right.
So it's something that, and that's not considering the tax implications of a land contract. I am not an accountant, but I have seen enough situations where people should have gone and listened to one. And I advise that people do that all the time. Same deal, ounce of prevention, pound of cure, right? So go speak to your accountant if you're going to put something like that together, because if you sell on a land contract, whatever the sale price was, oftentimes you wind up paying tax on that entire purchase price in the first year, even though you didn't get the money. And that's true. It's not always true. And that's why I say, it's important to talk to your accountant in that situation. Usually more true on a commercial side. But it depends on how long you've owned the home, the purpose of purchasing the home originally, what you've done with it. So it's not something to just walk into without being aware of how it's going to affect your individual circumstances. But yeah, playing lender should obviously be something that you may want to ask more questions about than Googling land contract, spitting out the form, filling it out, and figuring you're okay.
Right.
But I will say to anybody, if you do a land contract and you don't come and see a guy like Austin or myself, make sure to record it.
Right.
Just make sure to record, because the worst case scenario situation is an unrecorded land contract with intervening liens. So just if you do it, record it. Make sure that the world knows that you did it. Otherwise, you're opening up Pandora's box on the back end as well.
Right. And what he means by that is recording it with like the Register of Deeds, right?
Yep. Take it. I mean, we have a way of doing it efficiently on our end because we record all the time. But if the average person, without using any professional help, is going to record it, you take it down to the county courthouse, go to the Register of Deeds office, hand them the document, and say, "I'd like to record this, please." And the fee is $30.
Right.
And so it's not only a good idea; it's absolutely what you should do.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about, if you're a buyer and you're thinking about, I think what we're going to title this episode, Justin, is Cautions of Land Contracts, which is good because it's a good topic. So let's talk about the cautions as a buyer and a seller. From my perspective as a buyer, like I mentioned that, hey, the odds that if a house isn't selling, right? If a house, let's say someone has a house on the market for $100,000 and it's not selling in this market, well, something is wrong with that house. Okay, most of the time. So as a buyer, right? If they're looking for a house and the only way they can find one is through a land contract, it's probably going to be a house that's not moving on the marketplace, right? And so on the buyer side, the odds of finding a land contract that's a nice house that you want, right, that's going to last that's going to be something you want in the long term, are probably fairly low. Like someone would probably be better off if you're just looking for your own place, your first place, and there's no other reasons, I would say you're better off, renting until you can find traditional means of financing, and then at that point, buy a house traditionally, right? That would be my thoughts. And unless if you're savvy, right, and there's some tax implications or there's some ways that it makes more sense, and especially on the investing or commercial side, I know there's some ways that it makes a lot of sense to do land contracts as a buyer. But if your credit's not good, if your income's not good, realistically, there's a lot of downsides to doing a land contract, especially if you put a large amount down, and you can't get your financial shape, you can't get financially stable and in good shape, there's a lot of downside.
Oh, and what most people don't realize with a land contract is if Jim buys from Joe, right, and there's no bank involved, Jim isn't reporting your on-time payments to the credit bureaus. And so you think, well, hey, I've made timely payments for 4 years and didn't have a judgment taken against me or wasn't evicted or foreclosed on. Shouldn't that help? And the answer is, well, it doesn't hurt, but it doesn't help either,
right.
Because nobody knows that you were doing that. So even though you did something that should be reflected as being very positive from a credit perspective, no one's ever going to know.
Right.
And so that's why I think, and don't get me wrong, credit scores are complex. The algorithms are secretive. It changes, and that's done intentionally. But so I can't sit here on a podcast and tell people how to build your credit score, and I don't really believe anybody can. With precision,
Yes,
you can do some things that are obviously bad and some things that you figure are probably good.
Yep.
But there is a lot of things that I think people think will help that don't actually.
Right. 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2 with credit.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think that people go, well, surely in 4 years, my credit score will improve. Well, if you didn't take out a credit card, you didn't go get a loan, it might, but it's not going to improve enough to where if your credit was terrible, that now maybe you can go get that loan. So,
right.
The old advice that I know that I'm 38, that my generation was given when we were coming up was, make sure you go get credit cards and use them and just pay them so you can build that credit. I don't know if that's something that's helpful anymore these days or not, because I'm sure it's changed dramatically over the past 20 years. But what I would say is don't borrow from somebody and think it's going to help you if you need that help.
Right.
And the best people to consult with in that situation would be a lender.
Yep.
So that's where I think that if you are that, but you're absolutely right. I would think it would be better to rent, and that doesn't always necessarily help you either. But it would be better to rent and then buy later when your situation improves than buying a land contract, in my opinion.
Yep.
Especially considering you've got the deferred maintenance issue, which is really a concern of both parties. But if you've always had a landlord your whole life and feel like this feels like renting, there isn't a landlord there that's going to show up and mow the lawn or fix the shingles or replace the dishwasher when it blows. So, you have to be prepared for home ownership. And if you feel like you've already stretched on a land contract and now you've got to dump money into something, you may not want to do it, which is going to draw the ire, of course, of the vendor or seller in that situation. So when it matures, you probably aren't going to be on the same page.
Right. So, okay, so to buyers out there that are thinking about doing a land contract, right? So very simply put, if 1 out of every 100 sellers is open to doing a land contract, I think those numbers are probably about right.
Yeah.
But if 1 out of every 100 is open to doing it, right? What are the odds that house is going to be one that you're going to want to be in for a long time, right?
Probably low.
Probably low.
And then on top of it, remember, most of the time why land contracts don't work in the residential context is because the seller has a mortgage.
Talk about that. Yes.
So if the seller has a mortgage and is, most people on 30-year notes don't start paying on month 1 and go through month 360 and go, all right, I did it, right? That's very unusual.
Yep.
So most people that sell have some level of outstanding balance owed on their note that's secured by their house. So everybody colloquially refers to that as a quote mortgage.
Yep.
It's a loan. It's secured by a mortgage. So the mortgage still has a balance on it. And so if I say, sure, I'll just seller finance this, give me $5,000 down and you can pay me the rest over time and then we'll have a maturity event. In reality, you need that $150,000, $200,000 up front at closing that you never see. It goes directly to your lender to satisfy the outstanding principal and accrued interest.
Yep.
So a land contract really isn't even a workable option for most.
Yes.
And so if you are buying a residence from somebody who owns it free and clear, that typically, I'd say on average, most people don't wind up owning $150,000 houses free and clear.
Yep.
Usually, if you're in that financial situation, most people upgrade to that higher end. We're speaking generally here.
Yep.
But most people, I mean, if you think about a traditional family, has is younger, buys a lesser expensive house, their starter home. I know it's referred to in your industry, and then they want to upgrade as the family grows. They want a bigger house. They want to buy something that's going to be more expensive. They're almost never going to likely own that house free and clear.
Right.
By the time they'd get to the point where they might be close, they may be looking at downsizing at that point. So
Right.
That's why land contracts have to be a very specific situation, and usually it is going to be on the lower end of the purchase price spectrum. At which point, if I own a $120,000 house free and clear, and it's a 50, 60-year property, and I'm on my way out, I may not have been putting that new roof on. I may not have been fixing that plumbing issue, or even just updating the property in general.
Yep.
Which is going to be it's why I can't sell it for more.
Right.
I don't have what a lot of buyers are looking for in the market. So you're asking for a lot of troubles, both from the financing end, the legal end, and I think the actual ownership of the property end when you do that.
Right. Right. No, exactly. So on the seller side, now we talked about the buyer side. So on the seller side, right, let's say, again, we're generalizing here, but let's say that we have a 70-year-old seller that owes their house free and clear, and Johnny buyer comes up to this seller and is like, hey, I'll buy your house with a land contract, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe the purchase price sounds great. There's a couple of things that seller should be very cautious about when structuring a land contract, right? And they, at that point, like you say, we said, hey, it'd be great to consult an attorney on that. But if that seller gets into that, right? So let's say Johnny buyer only has $5,000 to put down, right? And it's a 4-year balloon, meaning that, hey, Johnny's going to pay $1,000 a month for 4 years. And at the end of that 4 years, hopefully Johnny buyer can refinance and pay off the existing balance on the property. Now, let's say, we're at 3 years and 11 months and Johnny can't get a loan.
Mm-hmm.
And now sometimes Johnny buyer gets really frustrated, right? He's like, man, I put all of this, I paid $1,000 on this house for the last 3 years and 11 months. And I'm not going to be able to like keep living here, right? Let's say like the seller enforces it, then Johnny buyer might trash the house.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at that point you have two options, right? You either re-up with the land contract, or you either do something different, or Johnny buyer gets his balloon. But I should say, in any point of time, let's say something happens to Johnny buyer and he trashes the house, right? He only put $5,000 down. The downside of having a land contract is that you might be stuck doing the dirty work of foreclosing on somebody if they're not paying. And, there is a lot of risk. Potentially the value of the property goes down quite a bit if Johnny buyer, something happens and he does damage to the property, or the maintenance isn't maintained. But anyway, yeah, exactly. So, but yeah, what are your thoughts? I mean, that's on the seller side. You got to be really cautious when you structure something like that too. You really want a lot down.
Well, absolutely. I mean, remember, lenders make money doing this.
Yep.
A vendor on a land contract isn't going to make money.
Right.
So if you're looking at this as a way, I mean, unless you're getting a great purchase price, and like you said, a lot of money down, the odds of actually having this be a profitable enterprise are pretty darn low.
Sure. Yep.
So really what you're doing is, I really want to sell and this is the only way I can find a buyer. So to me, it's a last resort of a seller. And yes, there is a way to where perhaps if everything works out, you could get money for several years, and maybe they took great care of the property, and then they just move out freely and willingly, and then you can just do it again, and then maybe sell it traditionally, and then you made all of that money, and you're going to look at yourself in the mirror and really pat yourself on the back for a job well done. That is statistically an anomaly.
Yep.
So one of the big things too is what sellers on land contracts don't always do is pay attention to things that lenders pay attention to. Did you pay the property taxes? That's a big one.
Yep.
Is it insured? If you're going to put the insurance requirement on the vendee and you don't check it, and then the house burns down and whoops, it wasn't insured, they're not going to pay you. So that's it. You just lost. And it's a big loss. Same thing with property taxes. I mean, you're probably not going to lose it to tax deed because that's a 3-year time frame typically, but you won't get notice of it because you're not the owner anymore. So unless you're paying attention and pulling the tax bill online and seeing, they didn't pay 19s, 20s, and now 21s is due, and I bet you they're not going to pay that. Now what are you going to do? Are you going to pay that tax out of pocket so that property isn't lost to tax deed? Or are you going to call up the vendee and say, hey, you were supposed to pay these taxes. Why aren't you doing it? They're going to say, I guarantee you, they're going to say, well, I don't have any money.
Right.
So now what? Now you're stuck. So now you need to foreclose on a land contract. Well, if you try that without a lawyer, you're crazy.
Right.
So you're going to need to go through the strict land contract foreclosure process. And it's not going to be, in fact, in my career, the only person that I've seen personally foreclose on a land contract for one of their own properties successfully was a judge. So it's not something that the average person is really going to be able to do. And quite frankly, I don't think he did it right. But he wasn't local, so I can say it. But he's I don't think he did it right. But it worked out for him in the end.
Nice.
I helped him out.
So and for our listeners too, a couple pieces of info that would be helpful to know is that property tax lien, like that's number one.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Yeah. So if you don't pay your property taxes, right, that attaches to the property. That's like number one. So here with a land contract example, right, I think you use the term the vendee, the owner, the person that's staying at the property, right? Mm-hmm. If they don't pay the taxes, then you, the vendor, the mortgagor, right, the person holding the mortgage, you come second to the property taxes. So you get paid in the case that you have to foreclose. Mm-hmm. The property taxes have to get settled first, right? Which, again, you're the mortgagor. You have the mortgage. Like that's coming out of your pocket, right? Am I right?
Well, it depends. If you're a traditional lender and you have to go to foreclosure, and as you're going through that process, you realize, well, they weren't paying you, but they also weren't paying the county. Or the city, and you see that there's $10,000 in unpaid property taxes.
Yep.
You've got a couple of options, but if you go to a sheriff's sale,
yep,
and you as the lender take the property back, that means you were the successful bidder, and I mean I'll use successful loosely, and there was nobody else that showed up to buy it, right? So yep. Typically contrary to popular belief, lenders don't actually want the properties. I can say that for sure. So. You get it back and you need to pay that tax because if you're going to sell it, the buyer isn't going to want to pay that tax. So for you to be able to market the property as the lender, you're going to pay that tax out of pocket. So it's a losing proposition.
Yep.
Same thing for land contract. I mean, if you are going to take that property back, those taxes are your responsibility. And if you don't do it, if you don't pay them
yep.
within a couple of years. Every municipality is a little different on their timelines, but eventually they'll send a notice that says if these aren't paid within 90 days, this property's ours. And mortgage disappears, your ownership interests disappear. It is now property of the government.
Sure.
So that is obviously to be avoided, and it's very easy to kind of space on those dates or not pay attention. It doesn't happen commonly, but it does happen.
Yep.
And that's sort of a tale of woe for anybody who's out there. To pivot slightly, if you are one of the people that like to go to sheriff sales, if you're one of the 30 people that call my office, the Monday before a sheriff sale, and by the way, I don't share bids. So if you're going to call my office looking to see what we're about to bid, don't, please.
Yep.
Just show up, and I'll be happy to let you know what my first bid is when we're there. But the issue with that is if you don't do your homework, as a buyer at a foreclosure sale,
Yep.
there could be $10, $15, $20,000 worth of taxes out there. And step one is if you're interested in a property, check online. I mean, it's very easy to do. And I'm sure a lot of people that do this commercially do it all the time.
Yep.
Check online, make sure that there's not a ton of outstanding property taxes, or if there are, it's in a risk that you're willing to accept, and you change your bid price accordingly. That's kind of step one and two. I mean, that's the most important thing. The other is, and this one gets a little tricky. Normally, it's the holder of the mortgage, the lender, the mortgagee,
Yep.
is in first position, meaning their funds that they provided the borrower are probably the funds that were used to purchase the property. If not, it was a refi. But usually it's the person in first position or the lender in first position. But every once in a while, somebody gets a purchase money mortgage for, say, $150,000, or puts 30% down, and 2 years later goes and takes out a line of credit,
Yep.
Home equity line of credit, we call it a HELOC, and goes out and takes a HELOC for $30,000 and secures it in second position, meaning that person who gave them that second loan may be from a different financial institution, who is now accepting payments separately. If those payments stop, that lender can also foreclose. And under the Wisconsin statutes, not only is the senior lender, the person or entity who provided the purchase money funding, not required to be a party in that lawsuit, they're actually not supposed to be and can get out if they are named. So a buyer at a sheriff's sale could look at, and I mean, the numbers, you could look at the numbers and maybe kind of figure it out if you're savvy enough. But sometimes the numbers are close enough to where the HELOC winds up being close to what that purchase money might have been, depending on how much you had down. So you don't know all of those variables. So you could show up to a sheriff's sale, buy property, think you got a great deal, and then all of a sudden turns out, there's a first position mortgage on here for another $100,000.
Wow.
And now that you're not financially liable for that money, but they can foreclose on that property even after you've bought it, and you'll lose everything that you paid to the second.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's no recourse against a junior lender in that situation or lien holder. You're just out of luck.
Yeah.
You're out of luck. And I have had calls like that occasionally. It's usually from the person who doesn't do this commercially.
Yep.
Says, hey, that house I've had my eye on for a long time. I was Googling and I noticed it's going to be going to foreclosure sale. Well, how can you walk me through this process? How would I do that? When can I get in to see it is always the question I get. And I go, after you buy it. Unless you want to go ring the doorbell and ask the people who are about to be shoved out if it's cool if you look around.
Yep.
Most people aren't going to want to do that.
Correct. Exactly. Yeah.
So yeah, you're buying it sight unseen as is. There's no representations. There's no warranties. So you can do as much of your homework as you can at the courthouse and online. But outside of that, I mean, you're taking a bit of a flyer.
Yep.
And so, being armed with as much information as possible is very good.
Yep.
That's when you can go to a title company and you can say, hey, this is what I want to do. What kind of product can you provide me? And for a couple $100, you could find out what kind of situation you're about to be in.
Right.
It might be worth the investment.
For sure. So that would be like in our industry, and we're going to transition here. I think if it's good with you, let's transition into how to buy a foreclosure.
Sure.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Hey everyone, I'm going to butt in here. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the show. It's been really fun with Justin. We are going to break this into a two-part podcast. The second part, we're going to talk about the tactical steps to buy a foreclosure in the Wausau market. Justin has immense experience on being on the auction block, being at sheriff sales, and we're going to talk about the tactical steps to buying a foreclosure. Join us on next week's episode of the show. You guys are going to love it.